Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the Jamf Pro 9.98 support webinar. My name is John Applebaum. I'm a customer success specialist here, and I'll be your host.
And my name is Mike Levinik. I am a senior technical support specialist here at Jamf.
So let's take a look at the agenda for today. We actually have a ton of content here, and we'll try to cover as much as we can, but we do recommend reading the full release notes, which again are available on Jamf Nation. If you search for release notes, it should be the first thing that pops up. We'll go over kind of what went into this 9.98 release, and then we'll cover our commitment to zero-day support before going into the full new features and benefits that came with this release. We may run a bit long, but we will provide time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to ask questions regarding any of the features we discuss, as well as any others that came out with this release. As mentioned, we do have a lot of content lists, so let's just get right ahead and dive into what comes out with Jamf Pro 9.98. First and foremost, the 9.98 release will provide zero-day support for Apple Spring releases, which are coming out. Additionally, 95 product issues were resolved, and a combined 36 new features and enhancements are included with this release. 22 of the 36 features and enhancements were actually feature requests submitted by admins like yourselves on Jamf Nation. So thank you so much for taking the time to put in those feature requests. As you may be aware or have heard, Apple is actually releasing updates for computers and mobile devices and tvOS this spring. And with Jamf, organizations like yours will be ready. Jamf Pro 9.98 offers zero-day support for the new capabilities in the latest version of Apple's operating systems, which includes iOS 10.3, macOS 10.12.4, and tvOS 10.2. This way, admins and your end users can take advantage of the new Apple technology the minute it becomes available.
We talk a lot about zero-day support around release time here at Jamf, and one of the reasons that we have to do that is because things are just a little bit different in the Apple world. Currently, 79% of iOS devices in the wild are running the latest major release of iOS, iOS 10. When you compare that to Android Nougat, there's only 2.8% of devices are running that. And if you look at something like Lollipop, which was released back in November of 2014, that's still running on about 33% of active devices. But Apple users tend to upgrade immediately, and you as IT admins know you don't want that to break your workflows, and both the IT admins as well as the end users are looking for those new capabilities. So in addition to zero-day support for the new Apple OS releases, there are some features and benefits which come up with Jamf Pro 9.98 as well. The big one that seems to be the hot topic right now is Apple TV management. It was possible to put Apple TVs into your JSS, but we've got some really great new options right now. This was a Jamf Nation feature request. This is one of those 22 that was pointed out, which was requested by admins like you. Probably the coolest part about this is zero-touch setup with DEP. We tested this ourselves in-house here, and it is awesome. You plug in an Ethernet cord to a 4th gen Apple TV, and then you plug in the power adapter and you step away. And 30 seconds later you come back and that Apple TV is enrolled in the JSS and it is ready to go. It skips right through all of the screens that you tell it to, and it's ready to be managed. There are also some new configurations and some app distribution that we can do with this. For example, there is basically like a conference room mode right now. It's really similar to using an iPad in single app mode for like a kiosk, but basically for an Apple TV, which is big if companies have their own conference room app or something like that they want to lock these devices to. They can now do that. We also have the ability to remote wipe and restart these Apple TVs. You can mass pair devices with the Apple TVs, and all of these capabilities are available to you for the same price as a regular iOS license. The other real biggie for this release is there are a ton of security enhancements. We're going to talk about a few of these, Before we do, we're just going to take a quick step back and we're going to take a look at like what is a certificate authority and how does SSL trust and stuff work. This is going to be the Explain Like I'm 5 version of this. So basically, a certificate authority is something that tells you who you can trust when it comes to websites. A passport is kind of the same as like a third party or an inherently trusted certificate authority like GoDaddy, Komodo, Let's Encrypt, DigiCert, things like that. No matter where you go, everybody's going to trust and respect that passport. On the flip side, a self-signed or a built-in certificate authority is kind of like a school ID. You'll see my college ID there. And this self-signed certificate is trusted by the people who are told to trust it. But if I want to travel to Spain, I can't show up at the airport and hand them my student ID and expect them to take that as a valid form of identification. So when new faculty comes on board at the university, we say, hey, this is our form of ID. You can trust people with this form of ID. They're good here at this university. That's very similar to the enrollment process. When you enroll a device in your JSS with a self-signed or a built-in certificate authority, it pulls down that certificate authority and it installs it and it says, hey, we're going to trust this. Now, the problem is that there are lots of self-signed ID badges out there. For example, we don't necessarily want somebody who goes to UW Stout to be able to show up at UW Eau Claire and say, here's my ID badge, you should trust me, because a UW Stout ID badge is not something that should be trusted at UW Eau Claire. And as long as we're performing SSL verification, these other badges won't be trusted where we want just our badge to be trusted or anything that is inherently trusted like a passport. So we have to tell our devices who they can trust. On the same note, just because Sam Johnson, VP of Customer Service at Jamf, has a badge that says contractor, doesn't mean that he should be able to show up at UW Eau Claire and be inherently trusted there. So with that knowledge in mind, we're going to jump back and we're going to look at how this actually affects Jamf Pro 9.98. When you first sign in to Jamf Pro after upgrading to 9.98, you'll notice this notification. And it says verification of SSL certificates is disabled. Previously, we only had the option of verifying SSL or not verifying SSL. But as we know now, part of the enrollment process is pulling down this SSL certificate and then trusting it. We can verify SSL just fine after enrollment if we're using a built-in, and that is now an option, and we do recommend that if you are using the built-in certificate authority for Jamf Pro, that you flip this to always accept during enrollment. If you're using some sort of third-party inherently trusted certificate, you should be able to use always without any issues. On the iOS side of things, there were some trust and SSL enhancements as well. These enhancements come from the Apple side of things, but they do affect your Jamf Pro deployment, so we're going to talk about them a little bit here because they're pretty awesome. These trusts that are pushed from DEP or configurator can now be managed by the MDM profile. And so when you enroll a device with configurator or DEP, that certificate is always going to be trusted. Previously, it was possible, and some students did figure out that they were able to go in and untrust the certificate authority, and that basically caused a communication breakdown between the devices, and we were not able to manage those. So now if you're using DEP or configurator, that's not possible anymore. Same thing if we're pushing one of these through a configuration profile from Jamf Pro. That is going to be installed, it's going to be trusted, and that little trust switch is going to be grayed out, and it cannot be untrusted. You'll notice, though, that we didn't talk at all about over-the-air or user-initiated enrollment with a built-in certificate authority. And the reason for that is the previous enrollment process involved pulling that down and then trusting it. That certificate authority is not going to be trusted on its own after you install it anymore. You'll notice this warning, which was always kind of there, but it's changed a little bit. Right after you download the certificate authority to install it, That last sentence there, this certificate will not be trusted for websites until you enable it in certificate trust settings. Like I said, this is a security enhancement that came down from Apple. Basically, the reason is it's entirely possible for an end user to enroll their device, to download these certificates, and we don't necessarily want people just going and trusting any old certificate, just like we wouldn't want to tell our faculty at our university, yeah, you can trust anybody with any ID badge, doesn't matter if it says our name on it or not. The error that you will see if you try to enroll a device is profile installation failed, certificate is invalid. So once again, if you're seeing this, basically what it means is you're trying to user-initiated enroll a device with a self-signed or built-in certificate. It's a pretty niche group there. We expect admins that are doing testing to be affected by this far more than students or anything like that, because DEP and configurator seem to be the way to go because you get supervision anyway. Moving forward, things like this may become more and more prevalent. Apple's pushing for ATS, App Transport Security. Third-party certificates are going to be more and more important, and if you think that something like this may affect your deployment, you may want to call into support here at Jamf and have a conversation about possibly moving to a third-party, inherently trusted root certificate for your JSS. The next thing that we're going to talk about is MySQL 5.7 support. This, once again, was a Jamf Nation feature request. We have had some people running 5.7 in the past, and they've had some mixed luck. We now fully support MySQL 5.7 as of Jamf Pro 9.98. MySQL 5.7 is speedier than 5.6 or 5.5. According to some tests that were done by Oracle, it's 1.7 times faster than 5.6 and 2.5 times faster than 5.5. If you are going to upgrade to 5.7, we do recommend that you run 5.7 14 or greater for the greatest security in your environment. The next enhancement that we'll talk about here is the ability to inventory configuration profiles. Once again, Jamf Nation feature request, you may be noticing a theme here. The ability to inventory configuration profiles in your Jamf Pro, regardless of where they came from. So we can now create smart groups based on configuration profiles, even if they were not installed by the Jamf Pro server, which is pretty fantastic. Up next, Jamf Nation feature request, managed Wi-Fi networks only. Students would sometimes take their devices home and go on their home network. They can get around the filters that you have in place at school. Some companies are concerned with protection of sensitive internal data. You don't want these devices going onto networks that you can't control. So we now have the ability with Jamf Pro 9.98 to restrict these devices so that they can only connect to a Wi-Fi network that you have pushed out from Jamf. So you'll create a configuration profile with a Wi-Fi configuration. You'll push it out to your devices. You'll make sure that it installs and that everything's good with it. And then you can turn on this restriction and your devices are not going to be able to connect at Starbucks or at home, any other unsecure Wi-Fi that you are not able to control. However, with great power does come great responsibility. Obviously, if you push out a restriction that says my devices can only connect to a profile that I gave them, and you don't give them a good profile, they're not going to be able to connect to the internet anywhere, and that sort of defeats the purpose of remotely managing your devices if they fall off of the network. Good news is there is a warning that will pop up. If you try to turn this restriction on and you don't have a Wi-Fi payload configured, it will warn you. You're going to want to make sure that that Wi-Fi configuration is good, though, because this doesn't necessarily check to make sure that the password that you're putting in to your Wi-Fi configuration is correct. So, awesome feature. There's a lot of people that are very excited for this. Just make sure that you have a known good Wi-Fi configuration in place on these devices. Otherwise, you may need to put hands on your devices in order to get them back on the network. Another Jamf Nation feature request was a little bit better control over class names and class descriptions and things like that. Previously, when we imported classes into our Jamf Pro server, they had a set name that they would come in with, and depending on the name of that and the identifier and the length of the name, it was entirely possible to have multiple classes with the same name or multiple classes that were very, very similar and difficult to differentiate. We now have this class naming format section in Jamf Pro. You can be really granular with how you are setting up your class names. You can choose course name, you can put a special character in there like space hyphen space, and then you could have, for example, instructor. So instead of just biology, you would now have biology space dash space Johnson. And we would know that that's Mrs. Johnson's biology class as opposed to one possibly taught by Mr. Smith. Lost mode was a feature which was introduced relatively recently, and it's been saving people a lot of grief. Basically, if a device goes missing, you can put that device in lost mode. It locks it so that people aren't able to do anything nefarious with that device. And it also allows us to track it from our Jamf Pro. We can go in and we get a little map and some coordinates to that device. However, if you've got a room with 60 devices in various carts and you're looking for one of them specifically, having a little Google map that puts a dot on the building that you're in doesn't really help you a whole lot. So we now have the ability to play a sound with lost mode, so that if you've got 60 devices in a room on carts and you're trying to find a specific one, you can have it play a sound and you can really zero in on that missing device immediately. Up next, some other iOS enhancements that we'll talk about a little bit. This was another Jamf Nation feature request. We now have the ability to restart our iOS devices remotely, and we can also shut down our iOS devices only. So, for example, it's August, you got a bunch of new devices in, you're going through, you're provisioning them, you get them enrolled, you get their configurations pushed out. There's a month before students show up. What do? Well, instead of going through and having to turn all of them off automatically, you could send a mass shutdown command through the mass actions in your Jamf server. You can also use this to shut down devices that go missing if you don't necessarily want to use lost mode, or to restart devices remotely if you think that possibly a restart might be a good troubleshooting step for an issue that an end user is having. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about memcached. Memcached is essentially distributed caching of services and data. So if you have data that the JSS is looking to get its hands on that it needs to deploy out to people, it can cache that information. And memcached allows you to have multiple servers which can cache that data, and then when Jamf Pro goes looking for it, it's got multiple places that it can go. There is now documentation on the clustering page, and the link that's there will take you to step-by-step instructions for setting up memcached. It's not required yet, and it will be in the future if you are using clustering. It's not something that needs to be set up now. We're just basically making it easier to set up memcached in the future with documentation and some configuration files that are laid down in place to make things easier for you. Those are all of the features that we wanted to get through. Thank you guys very much for attending. We're going to have some time right now to kind of go through some of these questions that were sent over.
Yep, and as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be posted online for future reference. As we're going through some of these questions, thank you so much for sending them in. We do encourage you to use as many resources as you have available, including the release notes, Jamf Nation, and your Jamf Buddy as well in support. So let's take a look at some of the questions that we have coming up. So Troy Reynolds wanted to know if we need to install MySQL separately. I think that means in regards to an upgrade.
Sure. So The Jamf Pro server is essentially just a MySQL database that we're accessing through a Tomcat web app. You can install them on separate servers if you like. It's not necessary, it's not required. We do need to have MySQL installed. If you're looking to upgrade to MySQL 5.7 and you're looking to install that separate from your current deployment, you certainly could do that. You could install it separately and then just point your current Jamf Pro server over to that new MySQL server. That would be something that if you're not intimately familiar with the steps to do that offhand, I would recommend that you get a hold of Jamf support to walk through that process.
And then on a related note to MySQL, is it recommended then to upgrade to 5.7 for JSS 9.98?
I'm a pretty big advocate of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. However, there are some pretty good enhancements with 5.7. The data shows that it is faster. If you're seeing that your MySQL server is having a difficult time keeping up, it might be something that you would want to look into. We are still fully supporting 5.6. It's not something that you absolutely need to do. And I would say that in the vast majority of our customers' environments, MySQL is not the bottleneck, and they shouldn't feel the need to upgrade. But it's more the fact that we're now fully supporting 5.7 because we have a lot of people that wanted to run it. And if you're running a new, or if you're installing a new Jamf Pro server, it's a lot easier to just install MySQL 5.7 than it is to search around on the internet for an old 5.6 installer.
Switching topics a little bit, we did cover tvOS and some of the new features that are available now with Jamf Pro. Some questions around limitations on the hardware versions, if there's support for first generation, second generation, third generation.
Sure. The DEP enrollment, the zero-touch deployment, is a 4th-gen Apple TV feature. The Apple TV that has, the touch remote and the different apps, the third-party apps that you can run and things like that. A lot of these new features and enhancements are centered around that new 4th-generation Apple TV. There's very little that we're able to do with the earlier versions, but to be honest, I have one of the earlier versions at home, and I'm not entirely sure what you would want to do with it. But yeah, the short answer to the question is that a lot of these new features are around the 4th-generation Apple TV.
So we've had a couple questions on the certificate discussion, whether or not there's any potential pitfalls for using the self-signed cert or the built-in cert, as it's known.
Sure. So I'm going to preface this by saying it's a complicated subject, and once again, I'm going to have to apologize to the rest of my support personnel here because I feel like I'm going to just make more work for us. But it may be something that if you've got questions, a conversation with a Jamf tech support specialist is probably in order. That said, a self-signed certificate should be secure 99.9% of the time. If we go kind of back to the analogy of the student IDs, it's not just that it's a student ID that somebody can go out and buy a printer and run off. These are the best student IDs with holographic images and RFID chips and all of this other stuff. We know that our student ID is secure and that somebody who has one is good. The problem is that Apple doesn't know, and my device that comes from Apple just out of the box doesn't know. So even though I know that we are secure and I know that my self-signed cert is good and that I should trust it, other people don't necessarily know that. And so it's just getting to the point where it's going to be recommended more and more. And it's also getting easier and easier. There's some fantastic projects out there, like Let's Encrypt is a new totally free project that's basically just trying to get everybody using inherently trusted third-party root certificates.
And there was some question too regarding our customers that are hosted on Jamf Cloud as to whether this would affect them.
No, our Jamf Cloud customers are all using inherently trusted third-party root certificates, so none of the SSL conversation from earlier will affect you at all. It's one of the advantages of our Jamf Cloud product is that we take care of some of these headaches for you.
And we've also kind of had some questions around the lost mode feature. Is there any particular configuration that would allow them to specify a particular sound that gets played?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to be honest and say that I have not personally needed to put a device into lost mode to hear what the end user experience for that is. However, I have been told that the end user experience is the same as if you sign into your iCloud and you play a sound from a lost device there. I believe it is a predetermined sound that we are not able to change. But like I said, I'm going to preface that by saying I'm not 100% sure, and I would hate to give false information.
And relatedly, I think there's definitely a desire to have that kind of feature for a lot of people, especially because of how many scenarios that it comes into play. So I think there's also a desire to see that on OS 10 as well, or Mac OS.
Yes, I'm sure that there is. I know that Find My Mac is a thing, and once again, I have not ever gone in and used that myself. I have been fortunate enough to not have my devices go missing. I do know that Find My Mac is a thing. I'm not positive if there is the ability to play a sound from there, nor whether or not we would be able to access those features from Jamf Pro. But I encourage you to head out to Jamf Nation, start up a discussion, create a feature request. As you saw from our presentation, well over half of the features that went into this release were Jamf Nation feature requests. It is by far and away the best way to tell our developers what you think is important to go into our product. So much so that even if we here internally have something that we want into our product, we create a feature request on Jamf Nation, and the ones that get upvoted and that the community wants are the ones that get put into place.
Great. I think another question that kind of circled around back to the tvOS and being able to enroll Apple TVs, how would that work between the 4th generation and then older models? What's the difference, and how would you go about doing that?
As far as enrollment goes?
Correct.
I know that the one-touch DEP enrollment is not something that you can do. I believe the only option for enrollment of a Apple TV, and I don't think 1st gen even can be enrolled. Once again, I'm not positive on that. I would hate to give false information, but I do know the ones that are not 4th generation, if they are able to be enrolled, the only way to enroll them is through Apple Configurator 2. And I believe we have a white page on that. Otherwise, somebody has a white page on that. I know that I've read it before. It may or may not be a Jamf document.
And then we also touched on the ability to do scoping or smart groups by configuration profile for OS 10. Is this also a feature for iOS?
I apologize. I'm going to have to say that I'm not positive on that one. We should be able to check on it relatively quickly here, but that's not something that I know off the top of my head.
Yeah, if it's not, then I definitely think it's best to use a feature request, like Mike mentioned on Jamf Nation, but it definitely is handy to have.
Absolutely.
Just going through a few more of these questions here. We'll stay on as long as we can. Just give me 1 second to review some. And as we're waiting, I did mention that the presentation will be recorded. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. If not, we'll definitely follow up as well afterward. For your reference, all the features that we talked about are included in the feature release notes that are available on Jamf Nation.
I did see one come across about the lost mode sound on muted devices, and that does work. The device can be muted and it will still make its lost mode sound. I have an Apple Watch and I ping my phone with it all the time, but my phone is muted 24/7 because I have an Apple Watch. So the experience is pretty much the same there.
And I think we also had a question regarding Apple School Manager and how to do an import of classes. I know that there's some new options that we discussed regarding configurations for those classes as they get imported.
Yeah. The process for how to import a class, I think, once again, is something that if you're not familiar with, feel free to give Jamf support a call. I could try to walk us through it here, but I think it would end up just being more confusing, especially because I don't have an Apple School Manager instance that I would be able to log in and show you. So I would end up just talking in circles and confusing everybody. But feel free to call Jamf support and have that conversation if you have questions about getting Apple School Manager set up in your Jamf Pro server.
And also we had a question, coming back to tvOS, of course, it's so many new things that are going on in that particular hardware environment, but is this possible to be updated over the air?
For Apple TV OS, I'm not sure. I know that we did get quite a few management capabilities on Apple TVs. For example, the ability that we have had on iOS devices to change and enforce the name of those devices, we can do that with Apple TVs now, which is pretty fantastic. And there are quite a few different commands and configs that we can do. I don't know if updating the OS version is on there. That is a very new feature of iOS itself, and it does, I know, require DEP on iOS. So if it is possible on tvOS, I imagine that it has similar requirements, and that would be something that the release notes would spell out all of the specific features that are possible.
And again, still on tvOS, Ben Houseward, you had a good question about the pricing for tvOS and what does that look like. It will remain at the iOS price tier?
Yep, they are counted basically just as an iOS license for licensing. So when we talk about tiering, we actually add your device total when it comes to tiering. So if you're going to get a new price tier for hitting a certain number of devices, we add up all of your device types for that. The tvOS management it's the same cost as an iOS license, and I have not worked in account management for a while. I've been in technical support purely for about the last 15 months, but I know that back when I was in account management, we just added up all the device types. So I imagine that purchasing, if you were to purchase 200 Apple TV licenses, they would get added to your total, and if that bumped you to a new price tier, you would get that new price tier for your devices. That would be something that you should reach out to your Jamf buddy to double check on. Like I said, I've been in tech support purely for about the last little over a year now. So.
And then regarding the lost mode features and playing sound with iOS devices, does the device have to be supervised in order to have those features work?
I believe that it does.
Yes.
Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily want you to be able to just track and lock like a personally owned BYO device or something like that.
So I think at this point we do have other questions that we do have coming in, but we will try to get our best answer for you guys on those. However, at this time, I think we're running a little short on time here, so if there are additional questions that we haven't covered in this webinar, please feel free to reach out to your Jamf buddy or Jamf support, and we'll definitely have this recording available for you in the future to reference as well.
Thank you guys so much for attending.